Here with me now to discuss is one man who knows these riots perhaps better than anyone else. Andy Ngo, he's a journalist and the New York Times best-selling author of Unmasked. Thanks for being here tonight, Andy.
My pleasure.
Great. So given the current trajectory of the George Floyd trial, do you think we could be in for another year of mass rioting if, in fact, Chauvin is not convicted of murder?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are militant left-wing activists like Shaun King and others who are basically foaming at the mouth for political violence and to happen again. They're stating that if Chauvin is not convicted of murder and sentenced heavily to a long term in prison, that they're going to take to the streets. So they've essentially put a gun to the heads of everyone on that jury, and I think the city of Minneapolis as well, and to an extent the United States, because it was dozens of cities in America and even internationally that had political violence in response to this man's death.
Yeah, and of course, and to your point, even after last year, that's when, of course, we saw some of the major rioting that really burned down so many cities from the East Coast to the West Coast. We really saw it on. You were there to capture a lot of it. And it seems like a lot of these activists, these left-wing activists, they kind of use any excuse to burn down all these cities. However, we always talk about the year 2020. But of course, even now in 2021, specifically when we look at the Pacific Northwest, like Portland and Seattle, the rioting is still going on, is it not?
It is still going on, and it's going to get worse as the weather starts to warm up. I think if you look at what all these militant antifa groups and BLM groups are actually saying, they don't care about the legal process playing out at all. The evidence doesn't matter to them. They've always conveniently ignored what we've known, that based on testimony as well as evidence from the medical examiner's autopsy report, is that Mr. Floyd abused drugs, and he had a fatal level of fentanyl in his system at the time of his death, and he also had meth in his body. So, you know, it remains to be seen what the trial will actually show in terms of, did Derek Chauvin actually murder this man? And that evidence and that process playing out is important, but listening to media commentators and those in the legacy print and broadcast television, all they want is one outcome only.
Yeah, that's exactly what they want. We see crowds in front of the courthouse area. And of course, that's what they are demanding. They're demanding conviction in this case, regardless of the evidence. But of course, when we look at it, of course, it seems like BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, some of the founders of the group, of the organization, do say that they have Marxist roots. We also see them many times marching in tandem and lockstep with Antifa. They seem to ride together, at least what we've seen over this past year or so. So what really unites these two ideologies, and then also what differentiates Antifa from BLM?
In my book, I write about how going back actually to the foundations of BLM in 2015, but accelerated in 2020, there's been a cross-pollination between BLM and Antifa. And ideologically, they do have different agendas, but I think crucially why they are allied together is because they view the United States itself as the enemy to destroy, which is why they call for the dismantling of our democratic institutions, law enforcement, the rule of law. They attack courthouses, etc.
And earlier tonight, we're discussing the Reinald case in Portland last year, in which he is alleged to have shot a Trump supporter, a conservative, in Portland. And then later in September of that same year of 2020, he himself was tracked down by the U.S. Marshals, and then he was killed in the standoff with them. He's someone who was self-proclaimed to be a member of Antifa. He at least said that he was a supporter of Antifa. He wanted there to be somewhat of a race war. He was really looking forward to that because he was also supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement as well. But it's interesting to note, after this investigation came out from the Sheriff's County in Washington, Washington that, in fact, he did initiate the gunfight that did lead to his death when authorities were trying to arrest him, is that when we look at it, Joy Behar, for example, just 2 weeks ago, before this investigation came out, she was also saying that Antifa doesn't exist. She was using that same old trope that we're hearing from the left, that Antifa is nothing but fiction. They don't really exist. And yet here we have Reinald, who, as I mentioned earlier, he did say he's Antifa through and through. So I just want to ask you, what goes through your head when you still see major celebrity figures who still say, basically to this day, given everything that we know in the cases that are going forward, that Antifa literally doesn't exist, that it's nothing more than a myth or a figment of our imagination?
Rhino, in his own words, in his manifesto that was posted on his social media, described himself as, quote, 100% Antifa. In his writings, aligned himself with that ideology, in addition to him actually being on the ground as an Antifa volunteer militant on the streets of Portland for many, many weeks before he murdered that Trump supporter. I think the reaction from celebrities like Behar and others to deny Antifa is the same impulse that drives them, for example, to deny when there's a religious element to jihadist attacks. They ignore the words of the attackers themselves or their history of posts and writings, or they may even leave behind a manifesto. On the flip side, you see when it happens to be like a white shooter who doesn't leave behind a manifesto, the public and our elite chattering classes are very quick to assign motives to them, even when the evidence doesn't show that. And I'm thinking particularly recent spa shootings in Atlanta, for example. So again, it's all about media control. I think the big takeaway from the completion of the 7-month investigation in Washington State is that it completely put to rest these claims by Antifa accounts that Michael Reinald was murdered by law enforcement who didn't identify themselves. They actually found in the investigation that there was a used casing of a pistol round that matched the gun that was on his body, and that the officers came and were identified by the uniforms they were wearing. So again, I think this is just another example of biased media taking the side of violent extremists and murderers that they're sympathetic to.
Andy, thank you so much for all of your hard work in covering this topic that is quite dangerous. It's something that we're really not allowed to talk about, I guess, if you ask the left, but of course you do. So thank you for your bravery in that regard. And thanks for joining us tonight.